I love people being able to bring themselves into that workspace to say, look, I really am ambitious. I want to bring this to the organisation. I'm passionate about people. I'm passionate about change, whatever that might be for them. I think if you see it, regardless of what level you are at, encourage it, grow it, and champion other people in that space.
If there was one thing the corporate industry could do, an organisation could do to enable people to feel more inclusive in their organisations, what do you think would make the biggest impact?
We can say all the shiny stuff out there and be, we want to be X, Y, and Z, but actually it's about how you make people feel. And I think for me in particular, if you know that actually that person means it, they are committed to it, they're showing me in actions, they're showing me in words, they're showing me in resources, they're showing me in how they want to challenge structures and systems, then actually there is hope to change that.
It can sometimes carry a level of trauma working in the EDI space, especially when you have personally experienced some of the challenges and now you're at the other end trying to break down some of those challenges and see how you can overcome them, but also faced with the reality of how dismissive maybe strategies and agendas can be to those challenges.
If power in the UK has a colour, it's still predominantly white.
It's quite common for a lot of organisations that the senior tiers of organisations are not diverse. And what that says to the organisation and what that says to people from diverse backgrounds is there's no space for you here.
Only about 11% of board members identify as Black, Asian, or minority ethnic.
I never understood the importance of representation in leadership until I found myself in a room full of people trying to have a conversation and they just could not hear what I was saying.
New research shows that fewer than 5% of the UK's top leaders come from ethnic minorities.
There may be a ceiling, you can break through that ceiling. You're not made to be stuck at a level. There is always room for progression.
I can't change the colour of my skin. I'm not going to change that I'm a woman. I can't change what class I am, and I don't want to either. I'm very proud of who I am and where I come from.
We were also talking about being authentic and bringing your whole self to work, but then it felt that we didn't necessarily mean it. We still meant just bring parts of you to work.
Bushra, welcome to the RISEilience podcast. It is an absolute pleasure having you here. And even from the first point that we connected, I just thought you've got to come and be part of this.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, I've seen your podcast and I think it's absolutely awesome. And I'm a bit of a fangirl. I follow you on Instagram. I think you do some fantastic work.
Thank you. Look, I have to start by asking, what made you want to do the RISEilience podcast? Maybe quite a big loaded question for the first one, but I think that would really help set the tone.
I think that having visible platforms for Black and Asian leaders is incredibly important. And one of the reasons I think that is because you've got lots of leadership podcasts generally about kind of emotional intelligence and ambition and how to develop a learning culture, which are fantastic. That you can learn those kind of generic skills from. But I think unless you can see someone like yourself in those positions, if you haven't seen them before, it gives you great inspiration to be able to think, okay, I experienced something similar to that. And actually, there's lots of us that experience similar obstacles or similar challenges or similar successes. And I think when I saw the podcast first, I thought, this is amazing. This is something we need to encourage other people to be able to associate with their experience and to be able to be inspired by others and to also be able to relate to those challenges, I think, to grow and learn from them as well. And there's just something about that visual representation. So it's not just a listening podcast. You can see people in person. And I think that makes a big difference.
Wow.
Yeah.
I feel like I need to take some of that for my strapline, but it's so true. Yeah. And, I know there's some amazing forums and networks, but really it's something about hearing about individual journeys that really connects people. I want to say almost helps people wake up and realize how real these experiences are and how many of us actually feel the same, but never really have a platform to discuss it.
Yeah. And I think it's about those kind of honest conversations. When we talk about leadership, I think when you're on the outside of that space, it can feel like it's a really glamorous role and you're heading these teams and you're doing all this brilliant work, which most people are. But when you're on the inside, it can feel like a very different space. And I think it's about being able to share some of those very honest experiences in a safe space to, I think support upcoming leaders, but also leaders in that space as well to say, actually, this is how it is for me. And to be able to work through those things together, I think is a great opportunity to have some of those networks and those supported people around you.
That's a beautiful way to portray it, because I never thought of it in that way, that actually, yeah, people think the role of a leadership, the role in leadership rather, is quite set up and quite easy. And, you referenced the word glam and that side of things. And actually, as a Black Asian minority individual, having moved into that space, there are some real challenges that I feel in a completely different way to when I was an officer
Yeah.
or a manager. And you kind of feel a sense of responsibility of making sure you take ownership of those challenges, because you are one of the few people representing.
I think with it comes some responsibility. I sense that a lot, that there are other people that are looking to you because you may be that one person within that very kind of white leadership team, and they're looking at you for that representation. They're looking at you for that voice, that advocacy. And I think that that's something that I've always thought about. When you see people in that space and they're looking up to you in that way, it's about saying, actually, if I can get here, you can too.
Yeah, exactly.
There's nothing special about me being in this space. This is how I navigated it, and that actually, if that's something you want, there's absolutely no reason why you can't have that. It's not such an aspiration that you can't get there, because sometimes that can feel quite intimidating when you see actually it's a whole white leadership team and I'm here and this is the way that I communicate, this is a social background I've come from. That might not feel as real for me, and I've been in that space myself, to be fair. But I think when you see people like you in those spaces and they're not kind of holding on to their seat at that table, they're actually turning back to say, actually, you can, the door's open, you can too, and I want to help mentor, sponsor you to help you into that space. And not in a disempowering way, because we've all got so many skills and talents.
So true.
And it's about reminding people that own those skills and talents, because that can get you into these spaces.
I love that. And you know what you've just said there, I think represents you completely, Bushra, because there's a real sense of you wanting to have a place where you can strengthen and enable and empower others. And I wondered where that stems from. Is it, have you always felt like actually part of your role, part of your responsibility is to bring and raise others up with you? Or is it something that you've only felt since moving into the space of leadership?
I'm not sure if it's the same for you, but I think it goes back to childhood, doesn't it? I mean, I was brought up in a Pakistani Muslim household,
Right.
and a part of our culture, our faith is giving, is charity.
So true.
And it was a part of our, genetics. It was a part of how we were brought up. My parents, when we talk about privilege now, we think about, education and money and all of those things. When we were younger, in our community, when we were growing up, my parents emigrated here, in the 60s. And my mum spoke English, my dad spoke English. So for them, that was a privilege that they had to share with others. So my mum would help, the communities when they'd get telegrams from Pakistan. She'd help them read it, and translate it for them, or they'd help them with, trying to apply for jobs or whatever it was. So we early on, we're like, as sisters, we learned very much that whatever power you own, whether that is you have connections, whether that is you can speak this particular language, you share that power with others, because that's incredibly important as a part of who we are. And there'll always be that inspiration. I think that kind of drove me to go into the charity sector as well. But yeah, I think it was that lesson of one really recognizing who you are, and it's not in a disempowering way. It's about, if I have this, I want to share it with you, and it's about that generous leadership that I think that's kind of tapped in for me now. It's about sharing that, and then I think it's about helping others to reach that same platform and continuing to help us grow as a community, as people.
I think that's amazing, because it was exactly where I was going to move into, which is a little bit about you, Bushra.
Yeah.
So really helpful to kind of understand the foundations, the childhood, and because that I think really connects to who we are for the rest of our lives. Really, it never really leaves us. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and whether it's the career journey, whether it's your own values and kind of lifestyle, in addition to that, is completely open to you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, growing up, so I come from a Pakistani family. I have 5 sisters. I'm the youngest of 5. And so I feel like I've had lots of female empowerment. My mum was a really strong woman, very ambitious woman. She really wanted the best for us to be kind of financially and educationally independent. And that's something that I will hold with me for the rest of my life. So it was growing up, I had my sister's kind of a big age gap as well. So I saw them go into the workplace, start that journey, and obviously my dad as well. So there was a lot of, I think, inspiration around me at being the youngest out of five to see women, like me, go into the workplace and do really well for themselves and start to learn about some of the challenges they had around motherhood and managing work and life and what that looked like, particularly being, Asian women and, having women of faith and what that meant to them. So early on, I don't think you're looking to learn, but that is your role. Those are your role models, and that's what you're learning in that environment. So I think that's kind of where my early kind of values set was really bedded, I think. And then kind of growing up in a very much a white community as well. So going into school where I was one of very few Asian people within that school, and then kind of learning that code switching very early on, I think, about there's lots we have in common. But that kind of culture clash piece was quite difficult at school, to be fair, about being able to understand and celebrate who I was, as opposed to kind of having to fit into some of those spaces that I didn't feel like I belonged. And I think as a young person, I love kids. I think they're fantastic at resilience and being able to kind of build those friendships above and beyond, your race, your religion, whatever it might be. And I think that when I look back now, I feel quite proud of that younger version of me that was able to connect with very many different people on from very different backgrounds. And I quite enjoyed it. So yeah, that's kind of a bit about where I've come from. And then kind of career-wise, I started off in the voluntary sector, in small voluntary sector. It was within the community that I was working and living, and that made a difference, I think, because it was like I worked within a women's refuge, domestic violence services for about 7 years. And it was probably the most humbling experience I've ever had. It was working predominantly with Asian women who were either in the refuge space or who were living in the community, still experiencing domestic abuse. And I remember coming home and thinking to myself, although you make a difference, I was so inspired by their courage because many of them were mums. And I had small children at the time, very small children. And I'd sometimes think to myself, they have so much courage and resilience. One, sometimes they had to stay, otherwise it was a lot more difficult for them to leave. We know that stalking increases as soon as you leave a domestic abuse relationship. But they were so empowering for me, thinking about how they kept themselves safe and their children safe and really wanted to leave. But we know the cycle of abuse keeps you in that space and pattern. But there was always that, I think, obstacle of being able to get adequate support, speaking out about it, going to housing and being told, actually, sorry, you're not a priority, or, trying to become financially independent and actually haven't done enough work experience because I've been at home and being a mum. So it was really a good way to see all of those systemic challenges that women face, particularly women of colour, in even trying to get the basic fundamentals in their life. And I think it made me see from a really interesting perspective about complex systems and how powerless some people can be within that space. And I'm a real fighter for social justice. I mean, when I started my degree, I did a law degree, and it was like, yes, I love this, but I love the human rights aspect of it, and went on to do the human rights piece. And I didn't know where I was going, to be fair, but I knew that making a difference was something I really wanted to continue doing. So I think that space really shaped me around listening, learning. And when we talk about empowerment, it's not about talking on someone's behalf or sharing their experience or doing anything like that. I think it's about encouraging people to be themselves in that space and not taking away their power, their light, or disempowering them by being their voice on their behalf, unless they've asked you to specifically. And that space really shaped, I think, where I wanted to go after that. And then, I got my job in the local authority, and that felt like a much bigger culture, much bigger space for me, and worked around refugee and migrant rights, again, very much with women as well. And then when I came into Redbridge Council, my first job there was working around social prescribing. Absolutely loved it.
Interesting.
I absolutely loved it. It was like we won lots of awards and things, like really shiny external things, but it was being able to bring the smaller sector groups together, which I'd known the challenges, and being able to bring all of those kind of partner work within that space, like you had the police, the fire brigade, you had lots of small sector organisations to support people and centre people right at that middle. And so we worked very closely with GPs in Redbridge to enable that kind of holistic support, centering people's experiences. So it felt very right for me. I think it felt like the right thing to be able to kind of move into that role. And although I kind of stayed at Redbridge for about 7 years, I had various different roles as I kept on moving around the transformation and culture piece. But I think it was very interesting because one of the things I always reflect on is that I've always been very outward focused. So really thinking about the impact out there, how we can keep moving, making that change making means something to me. And it wasn't until kind of, I think, maybe 2 years just before I left Redbridge that I wasn't a director at the stage, I was an officer, and a director came and said, look, I've just been this really good leadership course, and I think you'd be really good at it. And I was like, but this for assistant directors, and I don't know whether I would be suitable for it. And he was like, I think you would be. Like, here's what I did, and you just need to ask the chief executive to sponsor you. And I was like, that seems like a really big ask, to be fair. But I was really glad that he shared that with me, because I applied and the chief exec endorsed my application. It was like Solace Leadership
Brilliant.
Springboard.
That's
I know
the one.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it was such
So that would have been really early on, isn't it? That you went into it. Yeah.
So it was a great experience, because for the first time ever, I was amongst a lot more senior members of staff from across local councils who were so focused on their career. And I'd never seen that before, because my view was always out externally, supporting communities, the residents.
Yeah.
And it was like a light bulb moment that actually I can focus on my career. In order to grow and develop this out here, I need to grow and develop my own skills to have more influence to making that change out there. And I think they were very kind on the course, because everyone else, was a more senior member than me, but they obviously knew that I had probably least power in the room, being an officer level, and they very openly shared their experiences and how they were navigating their career and how they were navigating their challenges. But it was a real light bulb moment for me. A couple of years later, kind of went into Waltham Forest, and I think that was a bit of a turning point, because everything had been very services
That
centric.
was a head of service you went in as, isn't
That's
it?
it.
That was your first kind of leadership space role.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I actually took like a bit of a diversion in my career, I'd say. So as I was doing this solace and leadership stuff, I started thinking about, actually, in order to make an impact out there, I would like to make an impact internally, because our people, whoever we support within the organisation, ultimately will make a difference to those people out there. So how do we do that? And it was about building our internal culture. And so within Redbridge, I set up a leadership network, and it was outside of my commissioning role. It was about aspiring and established leaders within Redbridge. So I got like an executive sponsor, and it was the first time that I started learning about culture change, what that meant. And although I'd done lots of kind of the hard transformation change pieces, this was about really understanding organisation, systems, the practices, people, hearts and minds, that type of piece. And it was, funnily enough, when I went into the head of organisational development and people role, it really did feel like an imposter syndrome moment for me, because it was like, my background's always been like supporting people in the community, and now it's about people in the workplace. That's a very different beast to deal with. I loved it, and I think I had the right people around me, right senior members of staff, right mentors around me, to say, actually, all it is about transferring those skills that you have here into the workplace, and this is what the dynamic looks like here. So I only stayed in that role for about a year, and then I applied for the role that I'm in currently at Shelter, and that has probably been my favourite role so
Oh,
far.
really?
Yeah, it's. I think when I saw the role when it came up, the functions were just like, I had a little bit of expertise in each of them. So working with people with lived experience, and then volunteering, learning and organisational development, and then anti-racism and inclusion. And it was so powerful to be able to influence all of those areas and kind of heads of within those functions to really make the organisation really look at what an actively anti-racist organisation looks like.
Wow, powerful role, isn't it?
It's powerful in the sense that you've got the right functions in the right space to enable that change to happen quicker. They're not sitting in various different areas of the organisation where they can't influence as effectively.
Everything you've mentioned there, I just feel like anybody that's watching or listening is going to think, I feel that, I understand that, I get that kind of feeling that you have of, it's very relatable. And one of the things that I've noticed across almost everybody that's come onto RISEilience is obviously RISEilience only engages with leaders, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic leaders, and they all happen to have taken risks with roles, and where I find people are more challenged is where they stay in the same role for many, many, many years and just gradually maybe progress 1 or 2 tiers above at best. But it's always in the same organization. So how did you find navigating not just through different roles for an organization, but then across organizations as well? Is that something that's always been quite easy for you, or do you feel like you've had to kind of force yourself to do it because you know it makes a difference? Or is that not what you thought of at all? It was very different. It just happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes when we're in our comfort zones, it can feel quite difficult to make those changes. And although you may really want them, you may not know how to, or you may not have the support around you. Or for me, I had small children, and therefore I had to work flexibly. I had to be there for my children when they were at primary school and nursery and small babies. So they were the priority. So I needed to love my job, but make sure that that fulfilled a space for me where I could look after my small children. And I think as they kind of got into primary school, they were more kind of, in a kind of set routine. It gave me the freedom to explore. And I think there was something for me that it almost felt like the biggest risk was changing kind of going from a subject matter expert into a whole new area, which I was new and learning. And I think I would say that even though it feels quite scary stepping out of your comfort zone, do it anyway. What is the worst that's going to happen is that people will think, oh, she's not a technical expert in this, or, learn. And I think that's the point, is that even when you move into leadership positions, it's not about being a technical expert in every single area. If you can be, that's great. But it's about how you influence those specific technical experts to become productive, to really build the culture that you need. And it's about that emotional intelligence, that group intelligence, that leadership, that I think is the most important part of that leadership role, as opposed to being a technical expert or whatever that might be. And I think with the roles that I've had, I mean, I stayed at 7 years within the women's refuge role and then 7 years in Redbridge, but every 2 years I was in a different role. And that's because I just wanted to continue learning and exploring. And that might have not been to my advantage, to be fair, because I got a very squiggly career up until now. But I had a thirst for learning and a real love for learning. And I think that helped drive me into the space that I am today. So it wasn't a conscientious effort to get to where I am. It was almost by testing and trying. And I would say when you're in a role, if there's something that you're interested in, take a secondment, shadow people, ask them how they've done it. Get a mentor. If you are in a position yourself, mentor others, because you learn from your mentees. So it might open up that space where you think, actually, I could move into that role, I could do that. But I think as long as you are willing to commit to, I can't control the outcome here, but what I can do is put myself in a position to learn and just give it a go. Let's see what's the worst that's going to happen from it. And to be a bit braver in that, I would probably, if I were advising my younger self, is to say, just keep on going, keep on trying. And even though it feels scary, just keep giving it a go.
I think it's really interesting the words that you use, keep trying and keep pushing and because these are some of the areas that we really underestimate. I've always been a firm believer of, if you're too comfortable in a role, you need to start thinking about moving on, because if you're not growing and if you've figured it out and it's just your bread and butter now, then that's the point at which you're almost accepting, this is it for me. And I think when we have discussions like this, it's not just about us progressing, but it really is about that representation and enabling that at the top tier. And I think moving into that space, there's so many things I recognize, and I think, goodness, like, without representation, how are they making these decisions? Because it really isn't clear cut. It really does make a difference having people like us there. And have you found that, in terms of decision making, or how things are framed, or how things are presented, having yourself there at the top table and the added benefit of that?
Absolutely. And I think even like, as you say, if it becomes your bread and butter and you think to yourself, actually, I'm really comfortable here, you don't have to apply for that next job if you're not ready right now. No one's saying you have to do that. look at other opportunities that you're interested in. Find a coach, find a great coach or a good friend that's going to pull you out of that comfort zone and say, have you thought about this? You've got some really great skills over here. Try that. And slowly you can build that up. Some people like to take huge leaps. Sometimes I do, to be fair, but that's not for everybody. So I'd say keep learning wherever you are, just keep learning and moving yourself into the direction that you need to get to. Thinking about kind of leadership and that decision-making stuff, I think we talk about the diversity aspect, don't we, of being able to see that you've got that at the table. But actually, I think the question we need to be asking ourselves is, how do those people feel a sense of belonging at that table? How much power and influence do they have within that decision-making role within that? You might be a group of 5 or 4 of you. What power and influence is held within that room, and how is that shared by the most powerful person? Now, often I think with people dynamics, it might not be the person with the most senior title in the room. It could be the person that's actually really good at engaging people. But I think there's some work that needs to be done with senior leadership teams about understanding power and influence within their roles and remits and how they connect together, and how we, I think, actively and curiously listen to the life experience that people bring, as well as their technical experience and what they're telling you. What are they actually saying to you? And really having that kind of really deep listening space for people and holding that without judgment, I think is really important, because we're human beings. I think often as a woman, I've had to feel that I've had to be more assertive sometimes to say, no, actually, this is what I think, and this is really important, and this is going to be a risk. Some white male colleagues may not have experienced that, because for them, when they've said something, they've been quite direct about it, they're heard. And that's it within that one sentence.
Yeah.
But I think it goes back to, for me, around making sure that you've got the right minds as well across that leadership team. That diverse thinking is incredibly important. And that is so, I think, the most critical part of being able to make good decisions, is being able to really listen to those diverse mindsets across that table when you're making those critical decisions. And sometimes they're, even when you're in really high level pressured environments, that's when you need to do that more listening space, and being able to hear, actually, that view is completely opposed to mine. Why is it that I'm feeling so strongly and passionately about this, and what do I need to overcome as a part of making sure that we get the outcome that we need for the organisation, for our people? And I think that one of the things I feel really proud of, I suppose, more recently at Shelter where I work, is developing a psychological safety approach. And it was like kind of a big woolly term when we started the anti-racism work there. But I think that is your bedrock of developing inclusive spaces, and where people feel comfortable enough to be able to speak up, and to also be able to disagree constructively, but also recognize the impact that they're having on their colleagues. And I think with any workplace, you need to define what psychological safety means. So Amy Edmondson has a definition, but I think in organizations, we need to be able to understand that actually Black and people of color will generally have less psychological safety than their white counterparts. And what are we doing to address that within the workplace? What are we doing to be able to listen more actively to what they're saying, and why are they less likely to speak up? So I think if we are enabling that psychological safety where people can make mistakes, and they can put their hands up and say, I've made a mistake, you're going to have more of a productive team. You're going to have more effective decision making. You are going to create inclusive environments. Inclusive environments may be an aspiration over here, but you're going to be able to consistently start building that within the workplace. And I think that lots of challenge around psychological safety that I've had is around, does psychological safety mean that people are so comfortable that they actually don't have to bring their whole selves to work and they don't have to do anything differently? Actually, I think it's quite the opposite to that. In many ways, it's about being able to bring the best version of yourself and your view safely into that space and disagree constructively. And lots of studies and data will support the fact that actually it increases productivity, being able to share our kind of learning, our mistakes, and then make better decisions as a result of them. So I think for me, that's it is a really big program. It does take years to embed culture. Sometimes it can take up to 10 years for culture to change. But I think psychological safety and diverse thinking, and if you bring the allyship piece into that as well, I think start to build those foundations that really encourage Black and Asian people to start growing and feeling like they can contribute their best selves within the workplace.
And do you really believe the term psychological safety for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups is possible in the corporate industry at one point? Or because I know there's a lot of people that feel it will never happen. We can keep trying, but the challenges are so embedded, and the assumptions and the oversights and the lack of understanding is so strong, and lack of representation, that actually it's not even worth trying, which is sad. But then sometimes I'll reflect and think, or is that the reality?
In many cases, it is the reality. And I would say that if you are in an EDI role or a diversity type of role, it can feel incredibly exhausting because this is your day-to-day work, it's your lived experience, and it's your day-to-day work. And I would say, I think that culture change does take time. It depends on the organisation as well. Some cultures change very quickly, others will take years to change. I think you have to start by looking at your systems and structures within organisations. So it's not just about the kind of scene stuff around, oh, this is ELT, this is ADs, these are heads of service, and this is the wider organisation. It's about the messaging and the kind of complex narrative that sits behind those policies, procedures, and those structures that need open conversation and challenge. So you very much have, when you have an EDI role, you're almost acting like a critical friend to the organisation to be able to make those unsaid things quite visible. And in order, you can't expect your Black and Asian staff to have, you can't just declare this is a psychologically safe space, because it might be for one person, but not for others. It's about actively engaging those, I think, that feel less psychologically safe, to be able to say what it would be to make that space safe for them. And that will not happen overnight. And they will need to build trust with you as senior leaders to enable that to happen. There's something about having authentic and open leadership to really listen to that and for the what to be there. So I think it really does matter what your CEO thinks of anti-racism and inclusion, what your senior leadership team, and again, who holds most power within that organisation. Are they actively committed to that change? Because people will know. They will know. We can say all the shiny, shiny stuff out there and be, we want to be X, Y, and Z, but actually it's about how you make people feel. And I think for me in particular, if you know that actually that person means it, they are committed to it, they're showing me in actions, they're showing me in words, they're showing me in resources, they're showing me in how they want to challenge structures and systems, then actually there is hope to change that. So I think I can hear some people will say, actually, I've tried, I've been in that space, I've tried, and I can't move on. But I think it's about then breaking it down into smaller chunks to be able to say, right, systemic change. How do we create that? How do we create change within the hearts and minds? What are we doing actively around, bedding anti-racism into each part of the process of our journey within an organisation? What are we doing to create those less formal environments where people can bring their stories and feel safe? And they might not want to do that with the whole organisation. They might want to do it with people like them to be able to share those spaces in networks, sharing circles. I think the most important thing is about commitment and ownership from the senior leadership team to say, this is what we want, and it has to be top down.
That is so true, and something that I guess even I never really acknowledged before, that ultimately for real inclusion and sense of belonging and sense of, I don't know if the word acceptance is right, but that space of psychological safety, there has to be buy-in from the top, and it can't be superficial. It exhausts me to see organizations to say, oh, we have forums, we have networks, and we send out some comms every time it's Diwali or Ramadan or Easter or all of those kinds of events, and that for them is a very inclusive organization. But it can't be easy, trying to enforce those things when there isn't the level of representation that we need in leadership. Yourself as assistant director at the moment for Shelter, do you find that really difficult, or do you feel actually you have a way that has enabled a sense of difference in that space?
Yeah. I think one of the things about Shelter where I am at the moment is the charity sector. So they don't have as many kind of restrictions as local authority may have. And I think, all systems are built on spaces for white men generally, aren't they? At Shelter, I think one of the most interesting things is that the senior leadership team at the moment has, out of 5, 3 women of colour on their actual ELT.
Okay, right.
I think that's a real achievement, And I think that, yes, there's a long way to go with around making sure that we are more inclusive in our demographic of people. But I think the commitment I think they made just after the death of George Floyd about wanting to become an actively anti-racist organisation was really important. It was just like a reaction, I think, to all the horrific events that had happened, and actually as a realization that the housing emergency, at the sharpest end of the housing emergency, are Black and Asian people, and we need to reflect that within the organisation. Now, even though it's kind of very much at the forefront of wanting to kind of actively become an anti-racist organisation, just because you have Black and Asian people, even at that top table, doesn't mean that there is a sense of belonging across the organisation. So it's about being able to build in positive intervention programs such as succession planning, such as psychological safety programs for Black and people of colour. We will not tolerate policies around, if you are experiencing, some of those microaggressions within organisations, that that there's a procedure and a power that you can actually do something about it. So those things have to be visible, and you have to be able to, I think, translate that right to the front line, because often the people on the front line are experiencing something completely different to what the top table are experiencing here. So I think there is spaces that I think even within the organisation that I'm at needs to change. It is a longer journey to be able to become actively and fully anti-racist and embrace that. But I think they've started that journey, and they've started to put those things into place to enable that to happen.
Incredible. When I listen to you, Bushra, I hear someone who's so articulate and just really engaging in the way you speak. And there's a real sense of safety, when speaking to you, is because they're key leadership skills. And often, I think, from what I've heard from Black and Asian minority individuals who progress, they feel like they need a sense of authority and to make sure that people understand their views will not be overlooked. So as a result, they're slightly louder, slightly more direct, and almost come across as slightly more critical than they'd hope. How did you build your way of leadership? Because I think it's amazing. I feel so safe and comfortable, and yet you're clearly an expert in your field, in your industry. That really shines through for me. In comparison to someone who maybe almost goes in with the defense and goes in with a sense of, I'm going to prove to people I belong here, but in a way that sounds quite direct and less approachable.
I think if we understand that often when you get into those spaces that haven't been made or designed around you, that can happen. And it can happen quite easily because you're facing so many obstacles in that space where you're feeling like so many challenges around not being accepted, not being heard, not being valued. And I think it impacts women of colour mostly, to be fair. When we think about, what it takes to become a CEO and then be able to retain who you are, it's really tough. It's a really tough space. And there's some chief execs that have done it brilliantly and effortlessly and share that. But when systems aren't designed to embrace you, they aren't designed to flourish or encourage you to flourish, I think that can be a really tough experience. And there's a part of me that understands that. And I think that that's because you've had to become a certain way in order to be heard. And that is your coding, your mask, you're bringing your work mask in because that's how you're heard there. And I think that, if you spoke to someone who is in that space and we're talking about psychological safety, they would say to me, I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means because I've never experienced it. And in order to be successful, I've had to shout louder. I've had to, advocate for myself in this way because that's how I'm heard. And I hear that. I hear that completely. And I think that's when you start seeing burnout. That's when you start seeing, less collaboration and that less kind of open-mindedness to make those decisions that may not being able to actually, I disagree in a way that feels safe or going because 6 people are saying that it's the right decision. I can't say actually that feels completely wrong to me. So I think there is a space there that I can really hear and see people when they've got to that space. And I think if I've seen it and they trust me enough, I will try my best to create a space to say, hey, what's happening here? Because I can see it. I know I feel it too. And And I would encourage people that are in that space to be able to find a safe space where you can offload a lot of that, because it can really impact your self-esteem, your self-worth,
That's so true.
your family. It is not just happening in the workplace. And I think that in that space, you need to be able to have some space outside of work where you can not have that mask on, and that's really important. I think for me, and I'm not sure whether you've experienced it yourself, I think some of the assumptions people make about you being a woman, and what gravitas looks like, and you have to be more authoritarian, and you have to speak in a particular way. I think I'm over it, to be fair. Like, honestly, I just think to myself, I can't fit into any boxes. I just don't. That's the thing, and I can't fit into any more boxes. And I think the people that get you and that understand that you are just yourself, and you bring, your expertise or your life experience within that space, and that's what, I hate to say, is your unique selling point. I think that has created more, I think, safe space for me to say, actually, this is who I am. And like, when you get into a leadership position, you're going to be liked less. That's going to happen because you're not working as closely with your 5 individuals here. You're working across a massive organization. And it's okay for people not to agree with you. It's okay for people not to like you. What you have to, I think, build is that actually I'm okay with myself, that I know that, regardless of all the judgments that sit around me, that this is who I am. And I have people that love and support around me, whether they be colleagues or family or friends similar to you. Having a network of Black and Asian leaders, I think, is critical, where you can just take that deep breath and say, do you know what? It's okay because I know who I am. And I don't think that's a point that you get to, and I don't think that journey is ever over, because you get new challenges and new spaces. But I think it's about being able to connect with others like yourself to say, do you know what? Today I had a really tough day, and I felt that person was quite judgmental on how I was coming across. And for the other person to say, yeah, we know what that's like for you. And do you know what? I've got your back in that space. And that's where I think true allyship steps into that space, is to be able to say, I see your worth. And I don't have to say it directly to you. You can do that in any meeting. I see your worth and I've got your back in this space. And I think women do that quite well for each other. And I think we should pay it forward in that way, is that I think I love seeing people bring their authentic self. And although for some people, being your authentic self might feel a bit woolly, but I love people being able to bring themselves into that workspace to say, look, I really am ambitious. I want to bring this to the organisation. I'm passionate about people. I'm passionate about change, whatever that might be for them. I think if you see it, regardless of what level you are at, encourage it, grow it, and champion other people in that space.
Gosh, I think that is an incredible amount of reflection for anyone that's watching to take away, or listening, of course. And I guess there's a theme of certain things that you've referenced that is really important for us to note. So this is the area of doing more outside of the space that you work in. You mentioned the Solace program, so leadership development, but more importantly, I know organizations offer an immense and really helpful number of courses, programs, but sometimes they're very restricted to the eyes of the organization, I suppose. But looking outside at those opportunities, you mentioned coaching, which I'm a huge advocate of. I think mentoring's great, but I feel like coaching elevates it to another level and really builds on your strengths as opposed to weaknesses and things like that. Um, and then you mentioned networking, and these are all things that are optional, and you might have to work a little harder in the background to make that happen for yourself. How important do you think it is for individuals, particularly Black, Asian, ethnic minority individuals, to explore how to strengthen themselves outside of just their role, using some of the areas that you mentioned?
I think for any leadership role, coaching is critical. I think sometimes even counselling is quite important, where you've
For
got
the offload type reference that you made earlier, isn't it?
definitely.
Yeah.
If you're working in an EDI role, and you're a person of colour, or you have a lived experience or a protected characteristic, it can have a traumatic impact on you. And I think there's, we know about weathering and Black women and women of colour and how that impacts them. And I think it's about, like you said, Aisha, so beautifully, it's really important to be able to create that. I think it's like a support network around you, isn't it? So in coaching, you can really look at where am I going? How do I want to influence? What is the difference that I'm going to make? And for someone to give you some quite critical feedback, I think is so important. I love that. I love constructive feedback to say, actually, you're doing okay here, but why is it that you show up in this way within this meeting when actually you show up in this way in this meeting? What is it that you can do to change, influence, adapt? And where is it that you need to stand really strong in your ground to say, actually, no, I'm okay here. I don't need to flex and bend anymore because this is who I am. This is where I am. So I think a coach enables you to bring that independent challenge to yourself in a very safe space. And sometimes people like to be coached by people very similar to them or who have progressed further than them in a similar career. I quite like having someone with a very different style to me. Because I think that brings me a very different perspective and challenge to how I am, because it's almost as if, this is what I think of myself and this is my view, and their lens is something very different. So I think coaching is critical for senior leaders. I think even building coaching within the workforce, I think, is good as coaching skills for leaders and managers because it's critical to enable your people to grow. I think mentoring is really important, but I think reciprocal mentoring is even more important because, like I said, I think it's when you've got that mentoring space, and if you're being mentored, it's great because you're learning and you're actively being in that space where you can listen and learn to someone's experience and apply them to yourself. But the reciprocal learning part of it, I think, really helps. Um, One, you're listening to someone's experience that may have less power than you, but you're learning in such a huge way about your impact and your leader's impact within the organization, which is the biggest lesson you need to be able to learn. So it's about shifting yourself into their shoes to see it from their perspective. I think, you know, I would say create those spaces for yourself if they're not there. There are lots of generous leaders, I think, in certain spaces that want to be able to support, that may be slightly further along in that journey. Some are people are just aspiring and in that space. But I think we could do more, maybe within local authority, charity sector, to enable that space where people can feel that they can share their story in a safe way, but also share some of the challenges in a way where you can just exhale and say, this is what it was like, but then build each other up through that network. Um, so I think, yeah, because some actual networks, or like, if you've got the race equality network or the women's network, it might not have a space for senior leaders within that because you've got the whole organization. They might not feel comfortable with senior leaders being in that space. But I think if you had something for senior leaders to be able to help grow their potential, to be able to have a safe space, I think that'd be really critical to enable them to grow even further within the organization.
Sure. And one of the references that you made there is some real enabling, empowering leaders in the space who were really open to helping with some of these areas. Unfortunately, you also have the opposite. I know of more than enough people who have, their managers are quite um, restrictive in any options other than what is there right in front. So it's either what the organization offers for free or the budget is really, really low. Do you think in areas like this, whether it's coaching, whether it's big leadership development or something that pushes an individual slightly further than what is available more easily, would you say it's worth someone going out and investing in themselves with the expense of that? Or do you believe, no, if they're working for the organization, they really need to push it in that way, and if it doesn't work out, then maybe in the next role?
I think that's a really good question, actually. I think obviously there are budgetary restrictions when you work in the charity sector, when you're working in local authority, and that's kind of a bit of a given. I think in order to do EDI work, you have to have resources behind it. So don't set up an EDI strategy or an anti-racism strategy when you're not going to put the money behind it, to be fair. So that's kind of the foundation, and I think that needs to be owned again by the senior leadership team. I think I've always said to people that one of the biggest decisions you'll make in any role is who your line manager is, because they will either help you grow your career or you might end up moving on or not like your job very much because they have so much power in either being your sponsor, your champion, or they can actually hold people back. And we've all had a manager where they've kind of held us back or we've been restricted in that space. And that's where I think even more investment around leadership development is needed around management and what is the difference between management and leadership. And I would say if you are in the space where you feel like, actually, I want to develop more, find those opportunities within organizations that there are available, because there will be spaces around, some free courses within the organisation. There may be externally. Go and look. Find your learning and development team is what I'd say. Go and ask them, what are the opportunities here that I could kind of buy into? And then I would also say that it's not just about investment in yourself as well. I mean, if you have the resources, that's absolutely great. But if you find a role within the organisation that you really are interested in, ask the person to mentor you, because that will make the biggest difference in understanding how to practically get there. Learning and development is awesome. I think I'm a massive advocate for it because I think it grows you, you know, brilliantly. But being able to see someone do that role and understand what the challenges are, you might not even like it after a while because you'll think, actually, oh, I don't know whether I actually want to do that. But you are more wiser for that learning, that day-to-day practical application of what that role would look like. That doesn't cost anything. That what you need is a generous leader, and you need the want to learn. Don't just stop within your organisation. Find people on LinkedIn. Go and find people in different organisations, because you will find people that want to share some of this. Listen to great podcasts. You know, there's certain resources that you can tap into to really listen and learn if you have the need for it. But ultimately, I think organisations do need to invest in their people. You know, whether it's building some of those resources internally and being able to have some of those learning and development resources internally, or whether they bring them in externally. I think that's, in order for an organisation to grow, reach their mission, etc., you need to be able to flourish and build your talent to be able to enable them to do their jobs and get promoted in the organisation if that's what they want.
I love that, because not only are we agreeing that actually, yes, organisations need to invest, but also that not everything has to come down to a budget. There are so many options, especially in this day and age, everything at your fingertips. It just makes the routes and avenues into personal development and leadership almost unlimited, isn't it? The number of YouTube videos and, like you mentioned, podcasts and things that are out there. So I suppose one of the things that I really wanted to ask is, have you always been the leader that you are today? And it goes back to me mentioning, you know, how you come across as very self-assured, but, you know, in a really nice, humble way. So, you know, but it's just naturally there. Or was there a point, and what was that point at which you really embraced it and felt much more confident and comfortable in the space of leadership?
I think for me, it probably was when I got my first job in local authority around the social prescribing. Because although I didn't have the title of a leader, I had great management around me to encourage me to say, this is yours. And I think that's another way of being able to really share that learning, that development piece, to say, this is how I'm going to help you grow. So you have the decision-making capacity. I mean, if you're going really off target and not in the right direction, I'll let you know. But this is yours. You can own this. And that gave me so much, I think, trust in myself. And these people believed in me to do something, you know, big and something I really wanted to do. And I think being able to engage lots of different organisations built my confidence in having those conversations with various different organisations, being able to understand the difference between how the NHS and local authority interact and what the police's priorities were, gave me so much learning that it really grew my confidence in thinking that actually leadership isn't just about a title. Leadership is about how you connect with yourself, how you lead yourself first and foremost, and being able to make that difference and impact. So I think leadership means different things to different people. But I think ultimately, every single level, you own that leadership responsibility, because there's always someone that you're making an impact on. So I think for me, I don't think I've ever felt self-assured on the inside. There's always that part of me that has probably imposter syndrome, that's a bit of a perfectionist, that thinks I'm not doing enough or I'm not making an impact as quickly as I would like.
Healthy though as well, because you're continuously trying to improve and strengthen, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that will always be a part of who I am. I think that's something I've just learned to accept, that's when I get into kind of a space where I think I need to do more, impact more, that I have to just reassure myself that it's okay, you're in this space and you made an impact. And there's something about celebration in there, I think. Often I think we can drive ourselves really, really hard and we want to continue doing these things. And I think one of the things that I've learned is just to stop and pause, to say, do you know what, you're okay where you are at the moment and you are making an impact, and take a deep breath, because that journey is still ongoing. And whether you continue driving it or pause and recognize some of the great things that have happened around you, that is probably a really important part of that journey.
That sense of imposter syndrome is so common. I mean, I can't imagine anyone hasn't felt it in some shape or form at some point, or like you say, it just becomes a part of who they are. And like I said, in some ways, it's also a strength. I think sometimes imposter syndrome's considered as a very negative thing, and it holds you back. And a leader recently made me recognize that actually it's a good thing to have, because it keeps you questioning how you can be stronger and better every single day. So that's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
As well. So another reference that you made is how it can sometimes carry a level of trauma working in the EDI space, especially when you have personally experienced some of the challenges and now you're at the other end trying to break down some of those challenges and see how you can overcome them, but also faced with the reality of how dismissive maybe strategies and agendas can be to those challenges. How has it been for you being at both ends of the spectrum and leading in this space, at a place where you can make decisions, but also really see some of the blockers that you're having to deal with?
There is definitely something around being able to use your voice and being able to learn what is you can't depart those two things, your personal experience and then you're working for this cause as well. I think you have to really be able to understand how systemic change happens and what the kind of people and hearts and minds piece challenge happens. So there's a certain level of expectation that when you walk into an organisation that things aren't going to be perfect. They aren't going to be a fully anti-racist organisation. It's just not that. Until society changes and becomes fully anti-racist, you're not going to have organisations that are the same. But I think it's about being able to, be kind to yourself in that space. I think if you have other people like a head of anti-racism in that space, is making sure that they have the space and support around them to enable them to do that job, and to recognise that actually some of the trauma may be triggered through some of the experiences. If you've experienced racism or sexism or misogyny in your life, that you have that space where you can think, if someone makes a comment towards you or you're hearing some of those difficult conversations, is to be able to think to yourself, okay, yeah, my role is to sit here and challenge this. I might not need to do it in this moment if I'm triggered, for example. I could then take that away, reflect on what that means to me, and then come back to this conversation. But I think it becomes almost second nature. I think if you are quite self-aware and self-reflective, you know that some of those comments actually, I've heard them 1,000 times, they just don't bother me anymore. But there might be something on a deeper level when someone does have power or influence over you where it hurts, where you feel a bit on the outside. And I think it's just about, in those moments, recognizing it, capturing it, not ignoring it, feel it. And you don't have to raise your voice in that same space. You don't have to. Take your time. You can always come back into that space and say what you need to. So I think often it feels very pressurizing for leaders to be on it all of the time. You have to be responsive. You have to be able to do this. Actually, we're human beings within that space too. And we all come from very different life experience with different levels of trauma. I'm not saying everybody applying into these roles will have trauma. That might not be the case. But there will be people, and it's likely that if you are a minority, that you would have experienced some microaggressions along that journey. And it's important for your colleagues to recognise that, I think, rather than it being a space for you where it's just, oh, I feel like this because I've got 5 other white male colleagues and they may not have experienced that. So I think, again, it starts off with that safety that you're bringing or building within that leadership space. Whoever that person within that group who leads that space is to enable that, again, that psychological safety where it connects people to say, we have different levels of power in this room. What does that mean, look and feel like? And what do we need in that space? People may not feel safe immediately to be able to share that, but they will build trust if you bed it into every single part of the work and interactions you have with them, as opposed to it being something separate and out there.
I think you really draw light to how important it is to have the right leadership network around you. And I definitely, having moved, organization to organization, you can really see the stark difference and how it makes you feel. And something that's maybe right for me won't be right for another person. And I think you should really trust your gut with things like that, because it is something that you don't need to see how it goes. You almost feel it straight away. Do you belong or not? Are you enabled and strengthened to be your true self or not? And I think those things are really underestimated. For yourself, are you in a place of leadership now where you feel like, I've got this. You know, I actually am in a place where I'm quite content to continue being at the top table, making decisions that I know will support, enable, and empower Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups? Or are there any key challenges that remain? I know we mentioned imposter syndrome, but anything else that you feel, oh, this is the one thing that I feel it's just constantly there and I can't quite work around it as a leader? Or how would you reflect on that?
I think getting into this leadership space, often as women and as an Asian woman, I've had to do a lot of self-reflection. I had to learn about who I am. I've had to learn about what those challenges look like, how to kind of navigate really complex systems. And that wasn't something that comes naturally. I mean, I hadn't seen someone who'd been able to navigate those challenges before. So mentoring and coaching was incredibly important to me. Um, I think in any leadership team, I think the challenges is about building again those trusting relationships. And often it's about, when you're in those very high pressured environments, is about how do I make my point heard and seen? And that will always be a challenge, I think, being able to say, I disagree, I don't agree, and having that received, I think is incredibly important. So I think sometimes there's spaces that you're not called into, that you're not heard, or you might just, be in those spaces, but it's about being able to say, I think for me is centering always the impact that I want to make. So that's a part that will always bring back to me that there's people that have less power in the organization and externally than I do. And there's a real sense of responsibility that, as uncomfortable as it might feel, I still have to raise those concerns. I still have to be able to advocate on a lot of those issues. And that's my job as a human being, as a leader in this space. That's what I've signed up to. And it can feel like a very big responsibility. But if you have the right people around you, again, around the allyship piece, if you have the right people around you, it doesn't feel like it's solely on your shoulders. And at times it has felt like that. It has felt like this whole responsibility is mine. And it's been great to be able to have those conversations with some really great people to say, is it really your job to get rid of the full anti-racism in the whole world? Because that's the weight of the world that you're carrying on your shoulders. And that was almost like a relief when someone reflected that back to me. It was like, there's lots of us in this. It's not
Just acknowledging it, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, Bushra, it's been amazing. I feel like we need a part 2 because there's so many things that I haven't had a chance to ask that I want to ask, but I will end with the final question that I ask everybody on the podcast, which is, if there was one thing the corporate industry could do, an organization could do to enable people to feel more inclusive in their organizations, what do you think would make the biggest impact?
Actively listen to them and build that trust, and don't expect that trust from them until you have shown them that you're going to make a difference, and actually listen to them. In any space, be an active ally. When I say that, with your whole heart, be an active ally to be able to really hear them and really empower them in a way where they can feel they can build that trust with you and share how the organisation can become different and an organisation of choice and an inclusive organisation, because of their views count and you're going to do something differently with it.
I love that. And I loved how you frame the word ally, because I think it's used too easily in this day and age. And it is not just the listening with genuine intent, but also having the confidence as an ally to take action on it as well, for individuals that maybe don't have the space or the privilege to do so. Bushra, thank you so much. Absolutely amazing listening to your views, your thoughts, and your insights.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure, Aisha. Thank you so much.